Dead America, Lowcountry, Part 14. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 25. The sun peeked through the curtain on the far porthole of the boat prison. Grace was on her back, staring at the ceiling. It had been weeks since the cell had become her new home, and the worries about ever seeing anything different ran through her head, as they had every morning. She trusted Dante. She knew eventually she'd get out of there, but each day was a dangerous day. She had to survive. Her thoughts were broken by Hawk snoring in the cell across the way from her. She rolled over and looked out, the sun dimly lighting the room. The cells housed 6 adults, crammed into an area barely large enough for 3. But even with the cramped conditions, she knew they were in a better spot than a lot of people on the island. The stories she'd heard about the fight arena at the airport terrified her. Knowing that poor people deemed unusable by someone like Mosley were forced to fight for their lives against those things. She wondered how long it would be before she found herself in that situation. They'd cleared the island, and their off-island missions had been sparse over the last few days. It had only been 2 trips, and both were relatively inconsequential. "Dante, if you're going to do something, you'd better hurry up," she whispered to herself. "Huh?" Jackie murmured sleepily. "You say something?" Grace rolled over, looking at the bundle of woman on the floor beside her. With the limited space came trade-offs, which meant switching in and out of the lone bed in their cell. "Sorry," she said softly. "Just talking to myself." Jackie opened her eyes, blinking against the sunlight slowly getting brighter and brighter. "We really need a blackout curtain for that thing," she groaned, and let out a defeated sigh as she sat up. "I'd settle for just being able to sleep past dawn," Grace replied. Jackie snorted. "If you're not sleeping well in the bed, you might want to give the floor a shot," she said dryly. Grace chuckled. "We'll switch out tonight," she promised. "It's all good. The floor reminds me of my bed back home," Jackie said, rubbing her eyes. "Actually, this whole place does." She waved a hand around her head and then rested her arms on her knees. "My apartment wasn't much bigger than this." "A place this size in New York City?" Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. "How much did that run you?" Jackie smirked. "Enough that I couldn't afford a bed that was softer than the floor," she said. They shared a laugh, and Troy grunted from the other side of the bars. "Who do I throw my water bottle at to get another 10 minutes of silence?" he moaned groggily. "Not sure which one of you is the snooze button." "Sorry," Grace whispered, Jackie echoing her sentiments. He grunted and sat up in his bed. "Might as well get this day started," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Any idea what we're doing today?" "Hopefully it's something, because I'm not a fan of just sitting around," Jackie said with a sigh. "Have you tried laying around while shutting the hell up?" Eddie snapped as he hugged his pillow tighter. "Because let me tell you, it beats the hell out of fighting off rotten corpses that want to eat us for dinner." Jackie blinked rapidly. "I'm just saying I want to get moving and I'm just saying enjoy the downtime while it lasts," he cut in sharply. "Not everyone here enjoys the constant threat of death. You remember those times, right? You know, before all this shit went down?" She huffed. "Actually, if you saw the neighborhood I lived in, then you'd understand why I'm more comfortable with the constant threat of death." Laughter rippled through the room. "Yeah, fair enough," Eddie muttered, snuggling further into his pillow. Hawk's snoring grew louder, as if to accentuate the point. "I swear he could sleep soundly in a lumber mill," Eddie said. Grace reached over and grabbed a water bottle from the mini-fridge. "With snoring like that, the lumber mill would file a noise complaint," she shot back. More laughter overtook the group at the absurdity of the situation, combined with the need to ignore how dire it really was on the surface. "Any chance I can sleep on someone else's floor tonight?" Austin asked from beside Hawk's bed, raising his hand. "Yeah, I got you, brother," Eddie replied. "But if you start snoring, I'll figure out a way to throw you overboard." "I'll take the threat of drowning over another night beside this buzzsaw," Austin groaned. The lights suddenly flicked on, blinding everyone. They all squinted, moaning in annoyance, and a moment later the door busted open and Mosley sauntered in. "All right, up and at 'em, fuckwads," he barked loudly. "We got a lot of work to get done today, and by we, I mean you, 'cause I ain't doing shit." Troy wrinkled his nose. "Good morning to you too, asshole," he muttered. "Oh, got one with a bit of an attitude, huh?" Mosley asked with a sneer. "Little cranky this morning? Well, I know a good way to knock that shit right out of you. The latest contestants in the arena haven't been faring all that well, and it's really putting a damper on my entertainment. I bet I could get a few rounds out of you, big boy. Keep it up and I just might." Troy closed his mouth and lowered his gaze, though his cheeks were red hot. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Mosley snapped and stared around. Hawk's snoring intensified, and the mercenary drew his handgun. "Wake his ass up," he drawled, wiggling his gun in the air, "before I gotta set the alarm off." Austin quickly sat up, shaking Hawk until he snorted himself awake. "Huh?" Hawk cried sleepily. "What's up? Everything okay?" "Everything is just fine and dandy," Mosley declared. "Get up and get your shit, 'cause y'all are about to have a full-ass day. Up top in 5 or I'll be back, and trust me." He tapped the bars with his gun. "Y'all don't want that." He turned and strolled out, whistling an obnoxious tune. "Well, Jackie, you got what you wished for," Eddie groaned as he got to his feet. "Happy?" She peeled herself off of the floor and swiped her palms together. "Only going to be happy when that asshole is in the ground," she retorted. "Cheers to that, girl," he replied. "Cheers to that." Chapter 2. The 6 civilian warriors climbed down from the boat, stepping onto the grass just off of the dock. Everyone was still groggy, the floor sleepers stretching hard to work the kinks out of their joints. Hawk looked around, spotting 3 armed guards a few yards away, but none of the higher-ups that they usually saw before mission time. "Yo, expendable pawn," he called to one of the guards. "You know what's happening today?" The 3 men simply stared back at him, remaining stone-faced. "Can't talk, huh?" Hawk drawled. "That's about the IQ level I expect from an asshole in your position. Guess reading a book was too much to strain on your pea brain." "I have an English degree," one of the guards said in a monotone voice, still deadpan. This paid better than teaching, and depending on the school, this was the safer option. Hawk burst out laughing, shaking his head and bending as he held his stomach. "I still think you're a prick," he gasped, pointing at the guard. "But that was pretty good." The guard broke his dead stare with a half-hearted smirk for a split second, and then resumed his stoic watch. Hawk settled down and then clenched his jaw, warring internally with himself. He wanted to hate all of these guys by just painting them with the QXR brush. But they were real people, not just a monolith. Everyone had their own story, and everyone was trying to survive. Nowhere was this more evident than in No Name, who walked up towards them with his right-hand man Kemp in tow. "Morning, everybody," the bold mercenary greeted, brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Grace crossed her arms. "Mosley paid us a visit," she replied dryly. "Told us to get ready and be down here." No Name turned to his partner. "Something off-site today?" he asked. Kemp shrugged. "No clue, Commander," he replied. "If there is, nobody told me." The bold mercenary grabbed the radio on his vest and hit the button. "This is No Name. Do you copy?" he asked. "Go ahead, sir," someone from the command center replied. "Looking for confirmation that the VIPs are going off-site today," No Name said firmly. "Stand by," the operator replied. No Name lowered his hand to wait. "Not sure where they would be going," he muttered. "Pretty much everything on that main stretch out of Bluffton is cleared out." "Even the neighborhoods?" Kemp asked, cocking his head. "Yep, all the way up to the warehouse we hit," No Name replied with a nod. "Sir?" The operator came back. No Name hit the button. "Go ahead," he said. "Yes, the VIPs have been cleared to be moved to Mossy Oaks Island in Beaufort," the operator said. "Mosley is heading up the operation." The bold mercenary's gaze darkened. "Negative," he replied. "Kemp and I will head up the operation." "Sir, I have explicit orders that Mosley is—" "Are the orders from Theo Atkinson?" No Name cut in sharply. There was a moment of silence, and then the operator said, "No, sir, they are from Mosley." "Anyway, my order supersedes his," No Name quipped. "Let the on-site contact know the change. We will be departing shortly." "Yes, sir," the operator replied. No Name released the radio and turned to the guards. "I want a transport van as well as an assault vehicle prepped and ready to roll in 10, he barked. "Move!" The 3 guards muttered a "Yes, sir" in unison and hurried off. "Kemp, go pay our resident football player a visit," No Name said, turning to his friend. "See if he would like to join this little outing. We're going to need all the help we can get." "On it," Kemp replied, and headed off towards the waterfront housing. "Let me guess," Eddie piped up with a sigh. "Mossy Oaks is a shit show?" No Name nodded sharply. "And a half," he said. The group's shoulders slumped, and Eddie gave Jackie the side-eye. "You don't get any more wishes unless they are for porn stars and vodka," he muttered. She simply nodded in response, face pale. "How bad is it?" Grace asked. "It's a small island in the heart of Beaufort," No Name replied. "Large concentration of hostiles, so rather than clear them, the bridges to the east and west were fortified. The bridge and thin landmass to the north was obliterated via drone. Problem is, whoever the pilot was didn't realize that there was a hospital just to the south of the bombing area. My guess is we're going on a supply run." Troy threw up his hands. "Oh, good. Those never get old," he drawled. "Just like you assholes if you keep it up," Mosley barked as he approached. "Get ready to roll out." His eyes turned glacial at the sight of No Name. "They're rolling out with us," the bold mercenary said calmly. Mosley growled. "Like hell they are, Baldy," he snapped. "This is my operation and—" "And I've overruled you," No Name cut in. "You don't like it, you can take it up with Theo." Mosley bit his tongue, jutting out his chin. After glaring at his opponent for a few moments, a smirk curled his lip, and he pulled out his radio. "Charlie, report to the staging area," he said into the receiver. "Full gear, you're heading out." No Name raised his chin. "I have everything I need for this operation," he said. "And you don't go anywhere off island without Charlie by your side," Mosley shot back, pointing a finger at him. "You don't like it, you can take it up with Theo," he sneered. The bold mercenary didn't fight him on it, knowing that any pushback wasn't going to go his way. He was a bit concerned that Mosley was on to him and Kemp, but there was nothing he could really do about it besides continue to push forward. "If he's not here in 10, we're leaving without him," he drawled, sounding bored. "You have 7 minutes to get there," Mosley barked into the radio. "Move, boy, move!" He shoved the walkie-talkie back into his pocket and grinned up at No Name. "You assholes have fun today. I'm gonna go prop my feet up on the beach and have a cocktail." As he sauntered off, the rest of the group turned slowly towards the bold mercenary, and despite his best efforts, his brow furrowed slightly. "They're onto you, aren't they?" Grace asked, crossing her arms. No Name sighed. "Don't know for sure," he admitted. "But even if they are, there's nothing I can do about it besides continue to do what I'm doing." They stood there in silence for a moment. It was a bad spot, and No Name and Kemp risked their lives every day for them. "This isn't going to be an easy mission," No Name finally said, bringing everyone back to the task at hand. "The hospital was ground zero on the island, as everybody from Beaufort headed there when their loved ones fell ill. If you need to grab anything, do it now, because we're in for a long day." Chapter 3. No Name sat behind the wheel of the transport van carrying the civilian team plus Kenny, with Kemp and Charlie in the attack vehicle trailing behind them. As they drove across the heavily fortified bridge into Beaufort, Grace looked out over the water. The sun was high enough in the sky to fully illuminate the soft waves, rays reflecting brightly to the point of nearly blinding. "Man, days like this, I'd kill to be out in the water trying to hook a big one," Troy said with a wistful sigh. Kenny shook his head. "If I never set foot on another boat for as long as I live, I'll be a happy man," he said, raising his palms. "Nearly a week at sea with Captain Nico did me in." "He seems lively," No Name said slowly. Kenny chuckled. "That's an understatement, man," he said. "If it was in a cup, there was a 90% chance it had vodka in it, and a 100% chance it was the primary ingredient." "How do you even pilot a boat that's sauced?" Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. Kenny shook his head. "Gotta be something in those genes of his," he said. "Dude never missed a beat. Was even catching fish without a pole, just a reel in his hand." "Could never get into fishing," Hawk piped up. "If I'm going to sit on my ass drinking beer all day, it's damn well going to be in air-conditioned comfort with a big screen TV in front of me." "Shit, man. As long as there's alcohol involved, I don't care what I'm doing," Eddie declared. And everyone whooped and laughed. Eddie leaned forward, peering around at No Name, who had stayed focused on his driving. "What about you, boss?" he asked. "You down for some drinking?" The bold mercenary didn't shift his head. "I have different vices," he said flatly. "Oh, this should be good," Eddie drawled. "What you into?" "Heroin," No Name deadpanned, and the entire vehicle went silent. After several awkward moments, he chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you people are too easy. I've dealt with Mosley every day for the last several years. Of course I drink." The tension dissipated immediately, and Eddie pressed his palms together. "Shit, man. I've only been dealing with him for 3 weeks, and I'm ready to give myself alcohol poisoning just to avoid dealing with him." "Well, if you find something while out there today, I'm sure I can look the other way when we get back to camp," No Name replied. "Fuck yeah, man!" Eddie exclaimed. "I'm holding you to that." No Name made a turn before pushing the button on his radio. "Eller, come in," he said. "Go for Eller," came the reply. "Approaching the West Side Bridge with the team," No Name said. "ETA 5 minutes." "We're here, and waiting on you, sir," Eller replied. No Name nodded. "See you shortly," he said. The mood in the van flipped like a switch, from jovial and light-hearted to tense. The fun times were gone, replaced with the sober reality that a fight was coming. A big one. They stayed silent for the rest of the drive to the bridge, each of them mentally preparing themselves for the looming battle. No Name pulled up to the bridge, which had been blocked off with a combination of cars and sheet metal. The makeshift wall stood 8 feet high with 2 guards on top of the vehicles. They stabbed downwards with spears, clearing out some straggler zombies that had wandered up to it. The 2 vehicles stopped, and the mercenaries got out and approached the closest guard. The civilians lingering around the van and straining their ears. "You Eller?" No Name asked. The guard nodded. "Yes, sir," he said. "What's the situation?" the bold mercenary asked, crossing his arms. Eller motioned over his shoulder. "My men here are clearing you a path to get onto the island," he explained. "Every day there are a few of those things that wander up, so we have to do a bit of maintenance to make sure the wall isn't jeopardized." "I understand that our target is to the north?" No Name asked. "That's correct, sir," Eller replied stiffly. "The hospital is at the northernmost tip, about 3 miles from our current position." Charlie scoffed. "If it's 3 miles away and at the tip, then why the hell aren't we having them cross over to the north?" he demanded. No Name glared at the unwanted mercenary, and Mosley's lackey snapped his mouth shut. "Because it's jam-packed with those things up there," Eller replied. "We did a scouting run on the way down here, and there are a couple hundred within 3 blocks of the building. Don't know what they're doing there, just that it's a popular hangout." No Name nodded. "Probably attracted to the noise coming from inside," he said. "I imagine several of those things got trapped inside rooms, so they're banging on windows and roaming around. They love noise and are drawn to it." "Well, that's good, because nobody is getting in there without drawing them away," Eller said, and motioned for No Name to follow him over to his vehicle. He pulled out a sheet of paper with a crudely drawn map scrawled across it. The island was a large square with the hospital marked with an X at the top. There were 2 main lines coming down from it, one along the east and one along the west side of the island. You got 2 main roads running to the north and south of the island, Eller explained, pointing as he spoke. They're pretty close to the outer edge. If it were me, I'd send a decoy team up one side to pull the creatures away, then send the other team in. No Name nodded thoughtfully, impressed with the younger man's thought process. Okay, but what about evac for the decoy team? He asked, wanting to snowball on the idea. If they try to come back here, they're just going to lead the horde this way, blocking it off for the others. If they want to pull them down the eastern road, I can have a team waiting at that bridge to assist them, Ella suggested. Or if the hospital team doesn't mind a swim, they can escape to the north, although I really wouldn't recommend that option. No Name cocked his head. Why not? He asked. Because the drone did some major damage to the road and surrounding areas while taking out the bridge, Ella explained. It's several hundred yards of rough terrain with God only knows what buried just below the surface. Those things might be dumber than a sack of hammers, but they're resilient. One wrong step and you could find yourself in a world of trouble. No Name nodded thoughtfully. What are we looking at for the central part of the island? He asked. All residential, Ella replied. We haven't had eyes on it since the first days of this. The drone has been grounded due to lack of fuel, but if I had to guess, I'd say there's a fair amount of zombies in there. The bold mercenary raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? He asked. We've been doing a census of the survivors we've pulled, Ella explained. I think there's been 2 people from this island that made it. No Name sighed. Not a great ratio there, he murmured. No, sir, it is not, Ella agreed. The bold mercenary let out a deep whoosh of breath and nodded. Well, I'm impressed, he said. Keep up this kind of work and you'll have my job one of these days. Not my goal, sir, but I appreciate the sentiment, Ella replied with a soft smile. Stay on calm, No Name instructed. I'll keep you posted on our progress. Yes, sir, the young mercenary replied, holding out the map. No Name took it and then sauntered back over to the group, Kemp and Charlie standing and waiting with them. Okay, we need 3 teams, he said. Kemp, I want you to take Hawk and Eddie and focus your attention on the center portion of the island. It's primarily residential and most likely heavily infested. Weapons hot? Kemp asked. No Name shook his head. Negative, he replied. Kills need to be silent. Any noise needs to be minimal and targeted. Objective? Kemp asked, brow furrowing. You keep those things off the main roads, the bold mercenary instructed. Protect the eastern front first until the decoy team escapes. After that, shift to west. Kemp nodded and clapped Hawk and Eddie on the shoulder. Get your gear, boys. It's showtime, he quipped, and they headed off to the back of the van for weapons. Austin, Jackie, I want you to go with Charlie up the western side to... Hell no, Charlie interrupted, No Name puffing out his chest. The whole reason we got these civilians is so we don't have to go in there. Besides, I go where you go. No Name remained silent for a moment, as if contemplating his next move, and then stepped forward, staring the other mercenary down. I may not have any choice about you being on my team, he said in a low and menacing voice, but I'll be damned if I let an inexperienced loudmouth dictate anything about my mission. We're going to make sure this goes smoothly. If you don't like it, he pointed back the way they'd come. The island is back that way. Get walking. Just don't be surprised when they throw your ass in the arena for going AWOL. He continued to stare Charlie down, and the shorter mercenary visibly withered. That's what I thought. Now fall back in line and wait to be told what to do next. Charlie clenched his jaw and stepped back beside Austin and Jackie. As I was saying, No Name continued, nodding to them. You 3 are to move up to the western road. When you get into position, you create as much havoc as possible and pull those creatures down south. Kemp's team will make sure you don't get flanked by creatures coming out of the neighborhood. When you get a mile away from the hospital, you hightail it to the eastern bridge for extraction. Charlie threw up his hands. How the hell am I supposed to get those things' attention? He demanded. You're a trained soldier. Figure something out, No Name snapped. There's got to be something you can bang on, throw at them, or even give a whistle. Not going to take a whole lot to start a chain reaction. A few of them start moaning and coming your way, most of them are going to follow." He turned to the remaining 3. "You're with me," he said. "We're hitting the hospital once the coast is clear. We find the pharmacy, clear it out, do a quick inventory of the heavy machinery that looks usable, and we haul ass back to the Western Bridge. Everybody clear on that?" There was a chorus in the affirmative. No Name nodded. "Good. Get geared up," he said, "because we're going in." A few moments later, the group of 10 walked around the edge of the barricade. Ella had the car on the far left moved out of the way so they could go inside. Kemp drove the assault vehicle, an armored SUV, around the barrier, parking it on the bridge. Once everyone was through, he replaced the barrier, making the wall whole again. "Sir, I have a team moving to the eastern bridge as we speak," Ella said. "It'll be clear by the time your men get there." "Thank you," No Name replied with a nod. "I'll keep you up to date on our progress." Ella nodded sharply. "We'll be here, sir," he said. They reached the end of the bridge, stopping to look out. There was a major road in front of them that cut straight across the island to the other side. The north was a sea of trees and homes, and before they even started moving, they could see several ghouls moving in the shadows. "Looks like you boys already have some customers," No Name murmured. Kemp shared a fist bump with Hawk and then Eddie, and then all 3 gripped their weapons tightly. "Let's get to work," the mercenary said firmly. "See you in a bit, Commander." He turned to Charlie. "We'll be shadowing you up. Just move quick, because there's only so much we're going to be able to do silently." Yeah, whatever," Charlie drawled. "Come on, you 2, double time it." He took off at a brisk jog, and about 10 yards away glanced over his shoulder at Austin and Jackie. "I said move it," he barked. The duo glared at No Name, and he gave them an apologetic look, and they nodded, picking up the pace to catch up to Mosley's asshole. No Name sighed. "Okay, let's get walking," he said. "Sure we can't take the SUV?" Troy asked, wrinkling his nose. The bold mercenary shook his head. "Too much noise," he said. "Just wanted it here in case of emergency." Grace smacked Troy playfully in the gut. "You need to shed a few pounds anyway," she teased. "Walk will do you some good." Kenny pulled up his shirt, revealing a defined 6-pack. "If you want, I can get you on my workout routine," he joked. "Get you something to impress the ladies." Troy let out a defeated grunt as they started walking. "That's why I became a banker," he muttered. "Figured it was easier to get rich than get in that kind of shape to attract women." "Ew," Grace scoffed. "Why would you want to go for shallow gold diggers?" Troy rolled his eyes. "Do I strike you as a deep person?" he asked. She cocked her head and then nodded. "Point taken," she said. A chuckle rippled through the group, and they began their trek north. Chapter 4. Kemp, Hawk, and Eddie stood in the middle of the tree-covered street. They were 2 blocks away from the western road, and still about 8 blocks to the eastern one. They stood very still, looking out into the shadow areas, seeing plenty of movement everywhere they looked. "That doesn't look ominous at all," Eddie muttered. Hawk took a deep breath. "So, where you boys want to start?" he asked. "We have to start working over to the east," Kemp said quietly. "Knowing Charlie, he's going to pitch a fit about having to do this, which means they're going to have some issues." "Where'd y'all find that asshole at, anyway?" Hawk asked. Kemp shook his head. "Long story," he replied with a sigh, "but rest assured, it's nothing good." "Is anything these days?" Hawk quipped. Kemp cracked a small, sad smile. "Come on, let's get moving," he said. They trekked to the north, hanging a right on the next cross street. There was movement and moaning all around them, but nothing that was overly concerning or an immediate threat. As they reached halfway up the block, they spotted about 10 zombies around the next few houses, all of which were coming out to the street. "Think we should clear these guys out?" Eddie asked. Kemp nodded. "If we don't, they're just going to follow us," he replied. Eddie sighed audibly and readied his baseball bat, breaking off to the left while the other 2 broke off to the right. There were 3 zombies on his side, spread out over 10 yards. He wasn't concerned, having been through this dog and pony show before, casually walking up and swinging. The first swift arc connected with the side of a zombie head, cracking not only the skull but also the neck. Eddie paused to admire his handiwork, impressed with himself that he'd swung that hard and caused so much damage. The next 2 creatures fell just as quickly, albeit not as spectacularly. With the corpses on the ground, he glanced up at the nearest house just a few yards away. He sauntered up and peered in the window, seeing sights of struggle with blood on the floor and furniture knocked every which way. "They didn't have a good day," he muttered to himself. He turned around, watching the other 2 making quick work of their group of ghouls. Eddie walked back towards the road as they smashed and stabbed half a dozen zombies in quick succession, ending the threat. "Any problems?" Kemp asked casually as the trio reconvened on the road. "Nah, walk in the park," Eddie said, shaking his head. "Although I don't recommend we go into the house there." Hawk raised an eyebrow. "Bad time?" he asked. "Yeah, somebody got fucked up," Eddie drawled, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "We barely got through that first day, and we were heavily armed and had a warning before everything went down," Kemp said, shaking his head. "Can't imagine just waking up to this stuff." "Trust me, it wasn't fun," Hawk muttered. The 3 of them walked over a couple more blocks within 3 of the eastern road. They were forced to take out a few zombies on the way, but it barely caused them to pause. When they reached the next intersection, 2 blocks from the eastern road, they dove behind cover. A few yards up, there were easily 50 zombies, clamoring at the front door of a house. "Christ," Eddie breathed. "Yeah, that's a problem," Hawk murmured. "If that dumbass squeezes off a single shot, they're in trouble." Kemp grunted softly. "And he's stupid enough to do it, too," he said dryly. "How the hell we taking out a group that size with what we're armed with?" Eddie hissed. The trio studied the mob, watching as they pressed towards the house, unaware of anything else. "We might not have to," Kemp whispered. "Come on." He led the group back a block before cutting to the north. As they moved up, the next block was relatively devoid of ghouls, with just a few stragglers ambling about. They looked towards the west, seeing several blocks of nothingness. "Let's find us a safe house," Kemp instructed. The other 2 were confused but followed him, going back a full block before he led them into a yard. As he approached the front door, a ghoul emerged from the side of the house, moving slowly without the bottom portion of its right leg. "Eddie," Kemp said. The man in question broke off and caved in the creature's skull as the other 2 moved to the front window. They both looked in at a horrific sight. Blood splattered and smeared across the walls, zombies staggering about. Kemp tapped on the window and they turned towards him, moaning and snapping their teeth. "What the hell you doing, man?" Hawk finally asked. "Creating a diversion," Kemp replied. As he finally began putting 2 and 2 together, Hawk nodded in agreement. "All right, I think I'm tracking now," he said, and smacked on the window a few times. "Pretty sure you don't have to knock to go inside," Eddie drawled as he approached. "They won't mind." "Just getting them riled up," Hawk said. Eddie raised an eyebrow in confusion until his eyes widened, and then he sighed, shaking his head. "God damn it," he muttered as he realized what the plan was. "Can we have one day where we're not running from a horde of these things?" Kemp led them to the next house, looking inside to find everything fairly undisturbed. He knocked on the window, but there was no sound or movement from inside. He glanced at the driveway, noting that it was empty. "Found our spot," he said, and approached the front door, using the hilt of his machete to break out the small window. He reached in carefully to unlock the door and readied his weapon. "Clear it quick and lock it down," he said. The other 2 nodded, raising their bats and preparing to breach. Kemp threw open the door and they burst inside, scattering in different directions. One by one they swept their area of the house, yelling, "Clear!" when they were finished. Kemp lingered in the kitchen, looking out the back door into the yard. It was fenced in with a 5-foot-tall wooden privacy fence. He opened the back door, walking out and peering over the fence into the neighborhood yard. There were a couple of zombies milling about, and he tapped on the wood with his machete to draw them over. "So," Eddie drawled as he and Hawk entered the backyard, "we lure them in, hop over, and keep moving?" "That's my thinking," Kemp replied with a nod. "Unless you got a better idea." Eddie shook his head. "Nah, I'm good with it," he said. The first ghoul made it to the fence and Kemp reached over, stabbing it in the head with his blade, as the second one shuffled through the grass towards him. "Man, he's taking his sweet time, ain't he?" Hawk asked, cocking his head. Eddie wrinkled his nose as he studied the zombie's legs, where there were several large chunks of flesh missing. "If you looked like that, you'd struggle too," he said. Finally, the creature made it within striking distance, and Kemp put it out of its misery. They stood there quietly for a moment, listening carefully. They could only hear faint moans coming from nearby houses, letting them know that the coast was mostly clear. "Come on," Kemp said. "Let's go herd some zombies." The group took a few minutes to get back to the mob by the house. As they walked, they kept a keen eye out for ghouls along the road, only seeing a few that were tangled up in bushes. They stopped about 30 yards from the horde. "Normally, we'd let out a whistle to get their attention," Hawk murmured, "but I feel like that would be a mistake today." Eddie pulled out his machete and tapped it on the ground. The metallic clang echoed, not so loud that it resonated for blocks, but loud enough to cut through the moaning across the way from them. After several strikes, a handful of creatures turned around. They moaned excitedly and shambled towards them, but the group watched in dismay as none of their brethren followed. "Well, I gave it a shot," Eddie said with a sigh. Hawk shrugged. "Guess we should move closer." The trio walked several yards closer to the mob, gripping their weapons tightly. The 4 hungry zombies sped up a touch, but they were no match for the 3 armed living humans, who quickly smacked them down. With that threat out of the way, they stopped 15 yards from the back of the pack, and this time both Hawk and Eddie clanged their weapons on the ground. This alerted about a dozen ghouls, and they moaned loudly as they turned for a fresh meal. "That did the trick," Hawk said, and they backed up slowly, still clanging their weapons on the ground. They managed to pull another 6 or so away from the mob, the moans intensifying and pulling more their way. Within moments, about 30 or so were in pursuit of them. "Damn, didn't get all of them," Eddie groaned. Kemp shook his head. "Yeah, but we thinned them out enough that they're manageable," he said. They continued to backpedal, keeping a good 15 yards between them and the pack. "You two get up ahead and cover the road," Kemp instructed. "This might draw out others." "On it," Hawk agreed, and he and Eddie took off at a jog. The mercenary continued to walk backwards, staring at the mob as the zombies stumbled forward. He wanted to keep pace and make sure there weren't any that were a little quicker than the others. Hawk and Eddie jogged up about 10 yards, giving them some room to operate. As they moved, they spotted zombies starting to come out from behind houses, about 6 or so over the next block. "Gonna take 'em out," Eddie said, inclining his head to the 4 on his side. Hawk's brow furrowed. "You got it?" he asked. "If I can't handle 4, then I have no business being out here," Eddie declared, and strode to the ghouls. They were spread out over 10 yards, and he cracked one in the face and moved along the line, letting out a celebratory whoops with every fallen corpse. The last 2 were shoulder to shoulder coming at him, and he took a running start, swinging his bat as hard as he could to blow right through one's head and straight into the next. The bodies fell to the ground, the second creature still flailing. "Damn, I thought I had a twofer," he muttered. "One of these days." He flipped the bat around and brought it straight down on the zombie's head, caving it in. He did a quick scan of the area to make sure no others had come out on his side of the street. As he moved back to the road, Hawk was destroying the 2 ghouls at his side with ease. He shook his head. "How crazy is it that we're so comfortable caving in heads like we're heading out for a cup of coffee?" he thought. "This is one fucked up timeline, man." They converged back on the road and continued the Pied Piper routine, pulling the mob with Kemp back towards the target house. As they passed the corner, the ghouls inside the building there went crazy at the sight of them, slamming on the glass with rotted hands. A handful of the pack broke away from the mob to investigate the noise. "Damn, can't believe that actually worked," Hawk muttered. "That's a handy trick." "You two, get inside and make sure we have a clear path through the house," Kemp instructed. The 2 men sprung into action, racing forward and bursting into the house. They quickly swept the area, relieved that nothing had wandered in while they were gone. "We're good," Hawk yelled through the door. Kemp jogged up to the house, turning and smacking the door loudly to keep the mob's attention. "Out the back and over the fence. Get moving," he said. The two men complied, running through the backyard and hopping over the fence. When they landed, they ran up to the next house, looking around it to the next street to check and see what was there. There were a handful of creatures spread out over several yards. As they did this, Kemp stood at the back door, knocking on it to keep the zombies coming inside. About a dozen pushed into the living room, moving towards the kitchen. As soon as a single foot touched the linoleum, he turned and sprinted for the fence. By the time he reached it, a few zombies had found their way outside, stumbling over the door jamb and falling flat on their faces. "How we looking?" Kemp asked as he hit the ground. "Few stragglers, but nothing we can't handle," Eddie replied. Kemp nodded. "All right, well, first crisis averted," he said. "Let's go see what other trouble we got." Chapter 5. No Name, Grace, Troy, and Kenny walked up the middle of the road to the north. On their right were rows of houses, with the occasional zombie popping its head out and coming their way. To the left was a string of vacant lots, with some overgrowth. They could hear shuffling movement coming from it, but nothing emerged. "Man, this is a hike," Troy huffed. "And we're not even halfway there, man," Grace replied. "And we still have to come back." Troy let out a defeated grunt as they continued to briskly walk. Kenny smacked him on the arm when he spotted a zombie nearing the road. "Don't worry, man, I got you," the football player said, and jogged up ahead. He launched into a swift kick to the ghoul's chest and sent it toppling backwards to the ground. He pulled out his machete and cracked it in the forehead, dropping it before returning to the group, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Troy, you take it easy," he said. "You just point him out, and I'll take him out." The banker nodded, giving him a wave. "I appreciate that," he huffed. Grace turned to No Name, looking up at him. "Can I ask you something?" The bold mercenary cocked his head. "You can ask me whatever you like," he replied calmly. "If it's about my name or my past, don't expect an answer." "I'm more concerned with the immediate future," she replied. "What's going to happen to us when they run out of jobs like this to send us on?" He shook his head. "I'll be honest, I don't know," he admitted. "Theo and Mosley have been keeping me out of the loop on a lot of things lately, probably because they expect my loyalties aren't exclusive to them." "So have you come up with a plan to get us out of here, then?" Troy asked. No Name sighed. "Negative on that front as well," he said. "Security is tight on the island, so even if I could get you off the boat, we'd have no chance of getting you to safety. Can't go out on the roads because by the time we got to the bridge, they'd have it locked down." "What about getting us over to the island we hit the other week?" Grace suggested. "The one right across the water from the boat." No Name shook his head. "Ever since your brother launched his raid, Theo has doubled boat patrols around Harbor Town," he explained. "Every 5 minutes a patrol boat comes through with orders to shoot any unauthorized vessels on sight. Same with swimmers in the water." "Not a big deal since I drowned halfway across the water anyway," Troy quipped, raising his hand. Kenny clapped him on the shoulder. "Halfway?" he joked. "That's being generous." There were some light chuckles throughout the quartet, breaking a little bit of the tension. "Seriously, though," Kenny continued, "can you get them off that boat?" No Name took a deep breath. "I can," he said slowly. "But unless I have a solid plan in place of where they're going, I'm not going to risk my life to do so. We get one shot at this, and if things go wrong, I get a bullet in the back of the head." "What if we can get them to Captain Nico's boat?" Kenny suggested. The quartet went silent for a moment as they contemplated, and Grace turned, raising an eyebrow to No Name as if to ask him if that would work. "Okay," the bold mercenary replied thoughtfully. "But then what?" "We get them across to the mainland," Kenny replied with a shrug. "Based on how Theo treats Captain Nico, I'm assuming he's damn near untouchable." No Name nodded. "That's a safe assumption," he agreed. "So the boats guarding Harbor Town aren't going to do squat when they see him," Kenny continued. "We'll just say we're out for an evening sail, drop them off by shore, and head back." No Name pursed his lips for a moment. "That could work," he said slowly. "But there's a flaw in your plan." "What's that?" Kenny asks. As soon as someone realizes they're gone, the island goes on lockdown, and anything out of the ordinary is going to be investigated, the bold mercenary explained. Pretty sure the timing of your pleasure cruise would be at the top of that agenda. Kenny shrugged. To hell with it then, he said. We'll just come with you. I'm sure they appreciate the sentiment, No Name said gently. And I do as well. But you need to understand the kind of life you'd be signing up for if you did that. The football player shook his head. As long as it doesn't involve me being complicit in slavery, then count me the fuck in, he said, raising his palms. Captain Nico, too. We wouldn't be able to live in peace knowing what's going on behind the scenes. You've discussed it with him? No Name asked. Kenny nodded. Yep. Only reason we've stayed this long is because we felt like we were in a position to help, he explained. Figured we'd stick around to see if it was possible before bolting. No Name sunk deep into thought, the wheels turning in his head double time. Troy noticed a few zombies staggering out from behind a house and tapped Kenny on the shoulder, pointing them out. Yeah, I'm on it, the football player said and walked away from the group towards the creatures. Can it work? Grace asked softly. No Name took a deep breath. Yeah, it can, he replied. But we're going to need planning, which means getting in touch with Dante. I'm sure that'll be easy since you're being watched, Troy drawled, sarcasm evident in his tone. Are they watching me? Kenny asked as he jogged back up. No Name cocked his head. Not to my knowledge, he admitted. Then figure out a way to get me in position to deliver a message, Kenny replied. Before No Name could respond, half a dozen zombies emerged from a side street, moaning excitedly. I'll think on it, he said. But for now we need to focus on the task at hand. The quartet brandished their melee weapons, spreading out a bit so they didn't risk hitting each other. They walked up to the group of zombies, delivering precise strikes on them all. No Name took on a couple, as did Kenny, and they made quick work of the enemy. Grace and Troy each took one, and within seconds the fight was over. They continued on, occasionally looking behind them to make sure they didn't have any followers. Nothing popped up behind them as of yet, keeping their minds at ease. The next mile was quiet and quick, with the group wanting to give No Name the time to think on the coming plan, but also to keep focused on the mission at hand to make sure there were no surprises. Creatures would sporadically come out from a neighborhood, but nothing that caused any issue. A sign came into view reading, Hospital, 0.5 miles. Finally, Troy huffed. A few moments later, several gunshots went off in the distance. First, it was just a couple of pops, but it was quickly followed by a torrent of automatic gunfire. What is he doing? Grace breathed, brow furrowing. No Name grunted. Not being smart, I'd say, he said. That's going to pull every zombie on the island in their direction, Kenny said. As long as it pulls the hospital horde to the south, that's our only concern at the moment, No Name said firmly. Grace glared at him, crossing her arms. I know that sounds callous, he replied with a nod, but we have a mission, and that's the only thing we need to be focused on at the moment. Kemp and the others will protect them, which is why I'm not overly concerned. She took a deep breath, begrudgingly accepting his answer. When they reached the next side street, the final one before the turnoff for the hospital, No Name led them into the yard of a house. He inspected it carefully before forcing open the door. Without him having to tell them what to do, Grace and Kenny went into patrol mode, quickly sweeping the house with him. A few seconds later, everyone let out yells of, Clear! I want you all to stay inside, No Name instructed. I'll be right back. He reached into his vest, pulling out a small set of binoculars before heading out the front door of the house. He moved quickly to the edge of the yard, taking up position behind a tree. He looked down the street towards the hospital, seeing the several hundred-strong horde of zombies start to shift to the south, walking slowly. At least your stupidity is good for something, he muttered to himself. He walked back into the house, securing the door behind him. It's going to take a while for them to clear out, so might as well get comfortable. Ain't gotta tell me twice, Troy declared, and then collapsed back into a reclining chair, popping up the footrest in a fluid motion. He let out a satisfied groan. Oh, yeah, this is the stuff. No Name turned to Grace and Kenny. We have time, so let's do a quick search of the house, he suggested. Get anything that might help us cause a distraction in the hospital. If they don't pull all those things away, we're either going to have to fight our way through or move them. I'd much rather throw something than risk one of our lives." The duo nodded, and they set off to search the house, unable to stop themselves from worrying about the fate of their friends on the other teams. Chapter 6. Charlie, Austin, and Jackie walked up the eastern road, staying in the middle and watching towards the neighborhood for signs of trouble. Thus far, they had only had a couple of encounters with zombies, as most of them seemed to be taken care of by Kemp's team. The mood was tense within the trio, as Charlie quickly shut down any conversation between the others. While No Name and Kemp treated the civilians like humans, Charlie seemed firmly in the Mosley camp that these people were beneath him. As they walked, the hospital came into view, and it was a terrifying sight. There were a few hundred ghouls around the entrance, stretching through the entirety of the parking lot and back onto the street. They smacked at the door, desperate to get inside for reasons unknown to their audience. Charlie raised a hand to stop his companions on the road. He raised his assault rifle to survey the situation, looking through the scope. Austin turned as he caught movement from his periphery, spotting a zombie coming out of the neighborhood. "We gotta—" "I thought I told you to shut the fuck up," Charlie snapped. "There's incoming," Austin replied through gritted teeth. Charlie lowered his gun, turning away from the scope towards the houses. A lone zombie staggered towards them slowly, about 30 yards away. He rolled his eyes and returned to surveying the hospital. "Then do something about it, you worthless prick," he drawled. Austin and Jackie exchanged a glance, eyes wide with amazement at the man's general douche behavior. Austin shook it off, drew his knife and approached the zombie. As the creature stumbled onto the road, it fell down the curb and down onto its knees. Austin casually walked up and jammed his blade into the back of its head, leaving the corpse to crumple as he rejoined the group. Charlie continued to peer through his scope, scanning the landscape. "So, what's the plan?" Jackie finally asked, sick of waiting for him to figure out what they were doing. The mercenary growled. "The plan is for you to shut up until I decide what we're doing," he snarled. Jackie, being the tough New Yorker that she was, threw up her hands, finally having enough of this attitude. "Hey, asshole," she snapped. "We're in this together. Now you'd better start—" Stars exploded behind her eyes as he backhanded her. She staggered back, holding her cheek, gaping at him in shock. "You talk to me like that again and I'll put you down," he said, gaze on fire. "Not quick. Oh no, I'll put one in your kneecap and let you sit out here in the street. And if you don't think I'm serious," he raised his rifle and wiggled it. "Try me. Please, oh please, try me." She clenched her jaw, keeping her mouth shut for the time being. Austin gripped his knife with white knuckles and she shook her head slightly at him. She didn't think he would be stupid enough to try anything, but emotions were running high. He sheathed his blade with a soft huff. Charlie sneered at her and then turned back to the mob, returning to his surveillance with the scope. Finally, he lowered his gun, a devious smile on his face as he addressed his teammates. "All right, let's move out," he snapped and began walking. Austin and Jackie followed just behind him for about a quarter mile, too close to the mob for comfort. The moans were quite loud, filling the air along with the putrid stench of death. Even being so close, however, the zombies were very focused on their own mission, not paying the nearby snack any mind. "You see those mailboxes up there?" Charlie whispered, pointing to a set of metal mailboxes on either side of the road, about 50 yards up. "I want you to go up and start banging on them. Should be loud enough to get their attention and pull them this way." Austin cocked his head. "And then what?" he asked. Charlie shrugged. "You can do what you want, but if it were me, I'd run like hell," he said flippantly. "Now get going." Austin and Jackie started walking, moving at a moderate pace, but slow enough that they wouldn't make noise. They stared at the mob up ahead, hoping beyond hope that they could get into position before any of them took notice. They reached the mailboxes, readying their knives, senses on high alert. They exchanged a glance, and Austin raised a hand, doing a silent countdown to their racket. 3, 2, 1. Before they could strike, gunfire erupted from behind them. First it was just a few pops, but within seconds it became full automatic fire. The duo took cover, unsure if Charlie was shooting at the horde or at them. The bullets flew downrange, ripping into the back of the mob. A few found heads to embed themselves in, dropping some corpses. However, most ripped through torsos, causing non-lethal damage. The noise, however, was more than enough to gain the attention of the majority of the zombies, not just in the mob, but in the neighborhood and small row of houses to the east. Jackie and Austin stayed kneeling, watching in horror as hundreds of zombies turned towards them and marched, not even 50 yards away. "Jackie, behind you!" Austin screamed as several zombies emerged from the shadows at the sides of the houses near her. The ghouls shambled at a heightened pace, not running, but as fast as they could go, agitated and excited by the noise and sight of a fresh meal. Jackie scrambled to her feet, reaching the road as Austin leapt up. "You okay?" he asked. Jackie glanced at the horde, now about 15 yards away. "I'm fine, let's move," she urged. They turned back towards Charlie, who was just clapping in a new magazine, and aimed his gun towards them. "Get down!" Austin cried, and they both dove forward, laying face down on the asphalt and covering their heads. A second later, bullets flew, most of them towards the horde, but a few at zombies coming out of the neighborhood. Jackie craned her neck, staying low, and saw 3 ghouls catching bullets, only 1 to the head. 5 in total continued to march, unfazed by the gunfire, now within 5 yards away. Charlie continued to fire and Jackie grunted, rolling over onto her back and drawing her knife. She couldn't stand up and risk the mercenary shooting her, but they had to defend themselves somehow. The first creature reached her, almost falling on top of her with excitement. She managed to catch it in the chest with her fists, holding the gnashing teeth a few feet above her. Austin rolled over and stabbed the zombie in the temple, and the corpse fell onto her with its dead weight, pinning her to the ground. She thrashed her legs around, preventing the following creature from being able to latch onto her ankle. Finally, there was a break in the shooting, and Austin took the opportunity to launch to his feet and shove the attacking zombie back. It fell to the ground, tripping up another of its brethren, and Austin turned, throwing the corpse off of Jackie and helping her to her feet. They didn't speak, simply ran as hard as they could back towards Charlie, who slapped in a fresh magazine. His face split into a massive grin. "Oh man, when you hit the ground I thought that was it for y'all," he bellowed, and doubled over, laughing. "I swear I could almost smell the shit in your pants when you realized what was happening." Austin jutted out his chin, stalking forward with his knife in his hand. Charlie's jovial stature immediately disappeared and he raised his rifle, aiming directly at the civilian's face. "You'd better calm down there, boy," he snarled. "The higher-ups don't give a shit if you make it back or not. So if you're smart, you won't give me a reason. Lots of things go wrong on a mission like this, so it's not like it would even be suspicious, you suddenly being gone." Austin narrowed his eyes. "Pretty sure No Name would have something to say about it if we don't show back up," he said, and then put a finger to his chin in mock thought. "Lots of things can go wrong on a mission like this, so it's not like it would even be suspicious, you suddenly being gone." Charlie stared him down, and then smirked, lowering his rifle. "You got a smart mouth on you, boy," he drawled. "That kind of shit will get you in a heap of trouble." "Speaking of trouble," Jackie spoke up, jerking a thumb over her shoulder. The mob was still headed their way, 50 yards and closing, filling the entirety of the road and stretching back as far as they could see. "Don't know if we got 'em all, but we did everything we could," Charlie said. "Let's get moving." The 3 of them headed back south, moving at a solid, up-steady pace. The mercenary was almost strutting, seemingly proud of himself for putting the fear of God into his minions and accomplishing the mission at the same time. As they walked, Austin and Jackie fell behind a bit, not speaking but communicating with their gazes and head tilts towards Charlie. "You know, just so I know there's no hard feelings, why don't you 2 come on in front of me?" the mercenary piped up, glancing over his shoulder at him. "Don't want to give you the opportunity to make a mistake." The 2 sighed softly in defeat and skirted him, moving up front. They stayed at a modest clip, and the mercenary checked behind them at the horde still shambling forward. "Let's pick up the pace there," Charlie barked. "Move it!" The civilians began to jog, and he grinned as they shot him glares over their shoulders. Chapter 7. Kemp, Hawk, and Eddie were about 3/4 of a mile short of the hospital, 2 blocks away from the eastern road. They had to repeat their diversion tactics a few times, pulling zombies away from the road over several blocks to hopefully limit the number of them that would be pulled when noise started going. The trio sat in a house they'd taken refuge in. Eddie and Hawk around the kitchen table, and Kemp sat in the living room, staring out the front window. "Take a load off, bud," Eddie said through a mouthful of chips. "We got the big groups away from the road, they should be good." Hawk nodded as he swallowed a mouthful from the water bottle they'd liberated from the garage. "Hell, they're probably already on their way back to the bridge," he added. Kemp heard them, but continued to stare out the window. They were in a corner house, so he had a clear view of the road to the south. Just a few blocks away was the last decoy they'd set up. Nearly 100 ghouls pulled to a house, only this one with no fence in the backyard. Still, it was enough to keep them occupied. Eddie dug around in the bottom of his barbecue-flavored chips, shoving another handful into his mouth before turning the bag upside down over his face. Crumbs rained down, many landing on his nose and cheeks, and he moaned in happiness. "Take it easy, bro," Hawk said, wrinkling his nose. "No need to go that crazy." Eddie licked his lips and looked across the table, chip bits still all over his face. "Gotta savor them. They ain't making them anymore," he insisted. "Might be the last time I ever get to have them." Hawk looked down at his own bag of sour cream and cheddar chips, pulling one out and turning it over in his hand. "As depressing a thought as that is, you bring up a good point," he admitted, and put it on his tongue, chewing slowly. Eddie got up and went back to the pantry, digging around before finding another bag of chips, though this one was open. He pulled one out and crunched down on it, letting out a dissatisfied groan. "You good?" Hawk asked. Eddie nodded. "Just stale," he muttered. He stared into the bag and then looked around in the pantry some more, finding no more snacks. He shrugged and continued eating. Before he could take his seat again, muffled gunfire erupted in the distance. First it was just a few shots, but then fully automatic fire. "What the hell is that idiot doing?" Hawk asked. Eddie sighed. "Trying to get himself killed, apparently," he replied, shoving another few stale chips into his mouth. Kemp rushed into the kitchen, checking his gun. "Get your stuff, we gotta move," he huffed. "That is way too loud and way too close to the last house." Eddie threw the bag down onto the table with a grunt. "I'm guessing it would be too much to ask to pop that asshole in the back of the head?" he asked. "Day's still young," Kemp replied dryly. Eddie and Hawk chuckled as they grabbed their gear and followed the mercenary out the front door. They moved up towards the intersection, but were immediately forced to take cover. 2 blocks up, they spotted the front edge of the zombie mob wandering back towards the eastern road. As they moved, they could hear more automatic gunfire in the distance. Kemp listened carefully to get a rough location, shaking his head. "They're too far up towards the hospital," he muttered. "Even if they start running now, that mob is going to head them off." "If you don't shoot that dumbass, I will," Hawk muttered. "Something to look forward to," Kemp quipped. "But right now we have to figure out how to stop them." He inclined his head towards the horde. "We can circle around and try and pull them back towards the house," Eddie suggested. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, there was more automatic gunfire. Hawk sighed. "Not with that still going on," he muttered. The trio watched as dozens of ghouls walked past the intersection, headed towards the eastern road, only a block and a half from it. "If we don't stop them at the next block, we're not going to," Kemp said. "We need ideas, and we need them now." They sat there for another silent moment, looking around, and then Eddie pointed to the house across the street from them. "The hose," he insisted. The other two looked and spotted a large green garden hose rolled up in a plastic contraption with wheels. Hawk raised an eyebrow. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "We don't have to stop them dead in their tracks," Eddie explained. "Just slow them down so the others can get through. We just gotta get to the intersection before they do, tie it off on the street signs, and hope for the best." The other two shared a quick glance. Kemp shrugged. "You got a better idea?" he asked. "Other than mourning their loss? Nope," Hawk admitted. "Let's move then," the mercenary said. The trio broke from cover, running towards the hose by the next house up. As they went, they looked to the east down the side street, spotting a handful of creatures coming out from the backyards of the houses. "I'll get the hose," Kemp said. "Clear the path." Hawk and Eddie left him and ran down the street, machetes in hand. The creatures were all moving towards the eastern road, oblivious to the armed men behind them. There were 8 spread out on the same side of the street, all moving towards the road. Hawk reached them first, swinging hard as he ran by, taking the top of the head clean off. Eddie moved up several yards, using the tip of the blade and jamming it into the back of the next zombie's skull. As it crumpled to the ground, Hawk caught up to him, and the noise they were making drew the attention of the ghouls just up ahead. 3 of them turned and started coming back in their direction, but still posing little threat to Hawk and Eddie. The duo rushed towards the corpses, swinging away and quickly dropping them. Only one zombie remained up ahead. "I'll take it out," Hawk said, and darted forward as Eddie looked back over his shoulder. Kemp rolled the cumbersome plastic hose holder along the grass, presumably trying to keep the noise to a minimum. As he did, a zombie staggered out from the side of the house, right in the mercenary's blind spot. "Kemp!" he cried, and took off at a sprint, motioning for the mercenary to get out of the way. Kemp didn't react quickly enough, and the zombie caught a hold of his arm. He instinctively jerked away, and both of them fell over, the ghoul on top. He struggled to hold the creature's mouth away from his face as it thrashed about, grunting with the exertion. Eddie leapt towards them, wrapping his arms around the ghoul's torso and flipping it over. He hit the ground hard, sending the zombie sliding along the grass. "You good?" he asked breathlessly. Kemp quickly patted himself down. "No damage," he replied. The 2 men got to their feet, and Eddie stalked over and slammed his blade down into the ghoul's head. "Gotta watch those close calls, man," he huffed. "Gonna give me a heart attack." Kemp's eyebrows hit his hairline. "Give you a heart attack?" he asked, but they shared a quick chuckle before getting behind the hose holder and moving it closer to the sidewalk before continuing up the road. They caught up to Hawk, who'd finished clearing the way for them. When they reached the next intersection, they converged in the middle of the road, knowing their time was short. Eddie took hold of the hose and inclined his head. "You got the gun," he said. "Get up there and make sure we have time to put this thing in place." Kemp nodded and raced ahead with Hawk just behind him. They made it 2 blocks up to the intersection, stopping in the middle of the road and looking to the west. "Fuck me," Hawk breathed. There were around 100 zombies in the road, all coming their way. They were less than half a block away, with a couple of creatures almost there. Hawk readied his machete and made to run towards the fight, but Kemp put a hand on his arm and drew his handgun. "Let me pick them off," the mercenary suggested. Hawk shook his head. "Won't that draw more towards us?" he asked. "Probably, but I'm hoping the gunfire will get that asshole and the others moving quicker," Kemp replied. Hawk nodded and took a step back. "Have at it, cowboy," he drawled. The mercenary took aim, squeezing the trigger and taking the head clean off of a ghoul from 15 yards. He quickly adjusted his aim, firing again and dropping a second corpse. The final breakaway zombie was nearly at the intersection, but took a bullet to the forehead by another blast. By the time all 3 were finished off, Eddie arrived with the hose. He paused for a moment at the overwhelming sight of the approaching horde. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. Hawk smacked his shoulder. "Move, man," he urged. Eddie snapped back to it, pulling the hose over to the road sign to the north. Hawk grabbed the end and ran across the street, pulling it tight and tying it around the post. Eddie finished unraveling the hose on his side and tied it as securely as he could. The trio quickly moved behind the flimsy barrier, with Kemp giving it a flick. It was taut, giving only the slightest bit at his movement. "This is not going to hold very long," he murmured, and holstered his gun, pulling out his knife. The other 2 did the same with their blades, and Kemp looked over his shoulder at the eastern road, just a block away. It was miraculously clear of zombies. "Okay, spread out, hit them hard, and drop as many as you can," he instructed. "We just have to hold out until they get past us. Glance back when you can, yell if you see them or zombies." Hawk took a deep breath. "And if the line breaks?" he asked. "When the line breaks, you mean?" Eddie quipped. "Yeah, that," Hawk said, waving him off flippantly. "As soon as this thing fails, we bolt," Kemp said. "While being eaten would slow them down, I'm not about to make that sacrifice for that moron." Eddie and Hawk walked to either side, leaving the mercenary in the middle. When the 3 men reached within an arm's length of the line, they waited for the zombies to slowly march towards them. The wall of rotted flesh moaned, arms outstretched, agitated by the sight of fresh meat. Kemp glanced back, still not seeing anything on the eastern road, and then turned back to the mob. A cold realization fell over him that they weren't going to be able to hold out for very long unless he took drastic measures. He pulled out his handgun and opened fire, rapidly sending rounds into the crowd, aiming at head height and calling it a day. He sprayed the front of the horde with the remainder of his magazine, dropping half a dozen in moments. The fallen ghouls tripped up a few more, creating small pockets of bodies on the ground that held up the line. This might give them a fighting chance. The first few zombies reached the line on either side. Hawk and Eddie immediately started swinging their blades, the former opting for a baseball swing, the latter going for an overhead bash. Both men let out grunts and yelled out insults towards the zombies as they struggled to get clean hits. It only took a few moments before the hose line was filled with ghouls, arms flailing and grasping desperately at the men. Kemp wasn't exempt from the flailing either, as the pockets of empty space quickly filled in. He kept his handgun in one hand, knife in the other, and alternated strikes, stabbing one in the head and then firing off a shot into another. The center of the line was the most vulnerable to snap, and he took the ghouls out as quickly as he could. Even with his efforts, the hose began to stretch out, forcing him to take several steps back. Hawk glanced at the post, spotting significant strain on the hose. "It's gonna go," he bellowed as the rubber began to split. The trio darted backwards as it snapped, and the creatures at the front of the mob tumbled forwards, thrown off balance by their newfound freedom. As they hit the ground, dozens of others stomped over them in quick pursuit of the meal. They turned tail and ran down the street, glancing back when they were most of the way up the block. The horde was only about 15 yards behind them. "Get to the eastern road," Kemp urged, and they took off at a sprint. Reaching the road and looking to the north, they could see 3 figures a couple of blocks up. Kemp cupped his hands around his mouth. "Run!" he yelled. "Now!" Charlie and the others didn't speed up, keeping up at a jog, apparently confused by the instructions. Hawk and Eddie continued yelling at them as Kemp turned back to the mob and opening fire. He sent half a dozen rounds towards the oncoming ghouls, but it didn't do much. He turned back towards Charlie and the others, the gunshots having spurred them on to pick up their pace. He smacked Hawk on the shoulder. "Let's get up the road," he barked. They moved half a block up, walking backwards, watching as Charlie, Jackie, and Austin had to skirt the side of the road to barely avoid the zombie horde. They managed to get to the other side, the surly mercenary firing wildly as they went by. "What the fuck was that, man?" Kemp snapped as soon as the trios converged. Charlie shrugged. "Doing my job of pulling them away from the hospital," he said flippantly. Kemp growled, but he knew that they didn't have time to deal with this. "You 3, get running to the bridge," he instructed. "We gotta get back into the neighborhood." They bolted, tearing down the same street to put a couple of blocks between them and the pursuing horde. Finally, they slowed down, everyone breathing heavily, and Kemp took a few deep lungfuls before whirling on Charlie. "You ever endanger our lives like that again, and I will put you in the ground myself," he snarled. Charlie laughed in the face of the bravado, and Kemp shoved him back hard. Before there was any retaliation, Hawk and Eddie intervened, leaping between the 2 mercenaries. "Get moving, now," Hawk demanded, pointing at Charlie. The mercenary sneered. "I don't answer to you, boy," he growled. Hawk responded by lashing out and gripping Charlie around the throat, squeezing with his muscular hand. "That's enough," Kemp said, and Hawk let go, shoving the mercenary away from him. Charlie reached for his gun, but Kemp cocked the hammer back on his. "Would be a real shame if I had to put you down," he said coldly. "Now move." Charlie scoffed and let go of his weapon. "Come on, you 2. Let's get to the bridge," he snapped to Austin and Jackie. "Our job is done for the day." He motioned for them to go, and the trio jogged off, Charlie in the rear. "You should have let me finish him off," Hawk muttered as they watched them go. Kemp shook his head. "Too much at stake," he replied. "If he doesn't come back, that's going to bring a whole lot of scrutiny down on us, and frankly, we don't need that right now." Hawk grunted, but he didn't argue. He knew better, that the mercenary was right, and he didn't need to be throwing a temper tantrum. "Come on, let's get over to the western road," Kemp said. "The commander is going to need some cover to get back." They moved down the side road, heading back into the zombie-infested neighborhood. Chapter 8. 20 minutes had passed since the horde had begun moving away from the hospital. No Name headed outside, taking up position beside a tree and looking up. There were still a couple dozen zombies around the front door. "Not perfect, but going to have to do," he murmured to himself. He went back into the house, smacking a lounging Troy on the feet as he walked by. The civilian sat up quickly, snorting himself awake. "Huh? What?" he slurred groggily. "It's time to move," No Name said. Kenny leaned forward on the couch. "Clear?" he asked. "Couple dozen," the bold mercenary replied, "but no sense in waiting because I don't see them going anywhere without some motivation." Kenny grinned and reached down beside the couch, pulling out a plastic bag filled with golf balls. "Should be able to get the attention of some of them," he declared. No Name nodded thoughtfully. "Good call," he replied. "Come on." The group stood, including Troy, who didn't look too thrilled. They headed out to the street, everyone holding their blades and bats and preparing for battle. As they approached the hospital, reaching 100 yards away, Kenny pulled out a golf ball from the bag and let it rip. It soared through the air, bouncing on the parking lot about 15 yards behind the zombies pressed against the door. After bouncing a few more times, it gently tapped a ghoul on the back. The slight noise and light touch was enough to get the attention of the lone creature, and it turned and moaned, shambling in their direction. That noise attracted 2 others to do the same, but left the rest of the pack focused on the hospital. "Well, it's a start," Kenny said with a sigh. "Give them about 10 yards and throw again," No Name instructed. "The more we can break them up, the better." Kenny did so, waiting and then whipping another ball that managed to pull 4 more zombies from the line. He repeated this a few more times, ultimately getting half of the mini-mob away from the door, staggered in roughly 10-yard groups. Just before the first trio reached them, Troy let out a massive yawn, covering his mouth. "You awake enough to fight there, buddy?" Grace teased. "Or you want to find some place to curl up, and we'll get you on the way back?" Troy raised an eyebrow. "Wait, that's an option?" She playfully punched him in the arm before pointing at the zombies 10 yards away. "Go kill something," she demanded. He let out a dramatic sigh and stepped forward along with Kenny and No Name. Each of them lined up with a ghoul, striking at virtually the same time. With one perfectly timed swing, they destroyed the first wave of zombies. The next 4 approached, and Grace rejoined the guys, stepping forward at a steady pace to meet the corpses in the middle. Grace joined the line, and they repeated the process, barely breaking stride to strike them down. Several moments later, the ghouls that had pulled away from the hospital were down, oozing coagulated blood onto the asphalt. The group stopped about 20 yards away from the building, where a dozen more creatures were still clamoring at the front door. Kenny reached into his bag, pulling out the last 2 golf balls. He handed one to Grace. $10 if you peg one of them in the head," he said. "You're on," she replied, smirking as she took aim. She wound up her arm and threw the ball, smacking a ghoul in the side of the head, bouncing off and smacking into the one beside it. Kenny chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I owe you 20, he said. "Tell you what," she replied, raising a finger. "I'll call it even if you get us on that boat." He grinned. "Deal," he said, and they turned back to the hospital where the 2 hit zombies had turned to moan at them. Several more came with, and the group leapt into action. No Name lowered his shoulder and came in from the side, sending one corpse flying into several others, making their job a little easier. Kenny ran at the one closest to him, planting his foot into its chest and knocking over a few like dominoes, lunging down to stab them in the head in quick succession. Troy stabbed the first zombie in his path, and then used it like a battering ram to barrel over the rest, where he and Grace made quick work of the fallen creatures. A couple zombies were still completely uninterested, clawing away at the door. When they were the only 2 remaining, Kenny and No Name walked up casually, stabbing one each in the back of the skull. As soon as they fell, both men hopped back as the front doors of the building bulged out. A thick chain held them closed, but without the zombies pressing from the outside, the doors cracked open. A dozen rotting arms snaking their way out and flailing in the air, trying to get to the humans on the outside. "The mystery of why they were wanting to get in is solved," No Name said dryly. Kenny tongued his cheek. "But a new mystery emerges," he said. "How the hell are we getting inside?" Troy took a deep breath as he and Grace joined them in surveying the situation. "Better question," he said, raising his hand. "Are we sure we want to get inside?" "Afraid we have to," No Name replied, shaking his head. He inched towards the door, standing on his tiptoes to try to see over the heads of some of the zombies inside. He could see into the lobby of the hospital, and the ghouls were packed 20 deep on one side. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "That bad?" Grace asked. "Unless everybody inside is congregating around this door, we're in for a bad day," the bold mercenary replied. Kenny broke away from the group, walking over to the windows on the building and looking inside. There was a patient room that looked like a battle scene, with stuff knocked over and blood everywhere. Grace followed him and peered inside, shaking her head. "Okay, next room it is," she quipped. The group fanned out, checking the rooms on the 2-story building. One after another, it was a battle scene, with blood, body parts, and signs of struggle everywhere. Occasionally there was a corpse in the room, usually with something jammed in its skull. More often than not, the door to the hallway was open, and even though it was dim, they could see movement past it. Grace stopped at one, seeing it was empty. The door was open, and she couldn't see movement in the hallway. She glanced back towards the front door about 20 yards away and let out a sharp whistle to get No Name's attention. "What did you find?" he asked as he approached. Grace motioned to the window. "This might be our way in," she said. "Haven't seen movement in the hallway in a couple of rooms." "If we can get inside and find the stairs up to the 2nd floor," No Name said, "we can at least figure out where we need to go." She nodded. "That's my thinking," she agreed. The bold mercenary glanced at the other two, letting out a whistle and waving them over. As they moved, he pulled out his knife and worked the window, trying his best to pry it open. The latch finally broke as Kenny and Troy joined them. No Name turned to his crew. "Okay, we go silent once we get inside," he said. "I'm going in first to secure the door. Nobody comes in until I give the signal. Don't want anybody in my way in case I have to dive out. Understood?" The 3 civilians nodded, and he returned it, whirling back to the window and popping it open as quietly as he could. He hopped up and pulled himself inside, landing silently on the floor and readying his knife. No Name moved cautiously across the room, keeping his eyes trained on the door. When he reached it, he pressed himself against the wall to look down the hallway towards the front door. It was dark inside, with only the front windows and the occasional open door providing light, but he could see significant amounts of movement about 20 yards down. He watched carefully at the ocean of corpses, all pushing towards the front door. Satisfied that nothing was coming at him from that direction, he peered around the doorframe, looking towards the outer wall. The hallway went on about 20 more yards before hanging a right along the side of the building. There were some signs of struggle, but nothing was moving. Unfortunately, there were also no signs of a stairwell. No Name turned to the others and motioned for them to come inside, putting a finger to his mouth to let them know to be quiet. One by one, the group climbed inside, staying as silent as they could. Troy was the last one in, and he stumbled a bit as he hopped the sill, but Kenny caught him, preventing him from face-planting into the ground. The 3 civilians approached No Name, and he began giving hand signals to let them know about the zombies down the hall, and that they were going in the other direction. After affirmative nods all around, he let them out, knife at the ready. They quickly reached the end of the hallway, and he peered around the corner alongside the side of the building. There was very little light, however there was a large sign about halfway down boasting stairs. He stepped around and motioned to it, leading the group towards it. Halfway to the stairwell, a rotted arm lashed out of a room on the left, grabbing hold of Grace's arm. There was a massive clatter as the ghouls slammed against the medical cart wedged in the doorway. Grace didn't scream, reacting quickly and burying her blade into the creature's skull, sending it slumping over the cart. But the noise damage had already been done. Everyone stood still, tense, knowing they were in trouble. A few seconds later, agitated moans and the squeaking of feet echoed down the hallway. "They're onto us," No Name whispered. "Let's move." He jogged to the stairwell and pulled open the door, taking a quick beat to look around inside to make sure it was clear, before ushering everyone inside. As soon as Troy brought up the rear, Kenny slammed the door shut, no longer concerned about noise. No Name rushed up the stairs to the upper door, which hung open. 2 zombies staggered through it, and he kicked the first one in the chest, sending it careening back into the hallway. The other one he stabbed in the temple with his knife, shoving the corpse aside to take stock of the state of the hallway. He looked both ways, eyes widening at a couple dozen zombies coming his way, and ducked back into the stairwell, slamming the door shut. He put his weight against it, and the other 3 stared at him with concern. "Well, shit, what now?" Troy asked, rubbing his forehead. "Big group coming up," No Name replied. "Then let's get the hell out of here," Troy hissed. "Those things aren't to the downstairs door yet." The bold mercenary shook his head. "No, we need to get what we came for," he replied firmly. "How do you want to play it?" Grace asked. He thought for a moment and then took a deep breath. "We're going to create an assembly line of death," he said. Kenny raised an eyebrow. "That sounds cool as hell, even if I'm not following," he admitted. Before No Name could start explaining, there were slaps on the door, and he braced against it. "I'm going to open this door just wide enough for one of them to come through," he said quickly. "Kenny, you grab it and shove it over to Troy, who is going to flip it over the railing. Let gravity do the rest." "Sounds like a fun bloody time," Kenny replied. Grace raised a hand. "What am I doing?" she asked. "You're the safety valve," No Name replied. "If more than one comes in, you take them out. You also need to keep watch below in case they survive the fall and start coming up the stairs." She nodded sharply. "Got it," she said. The banging on the door intensified, and No Name turned sideways to get into position. "Ready?" "Hell yeah," Kenny replied, drowning out the other 2. The bold mercenary adjusted his stance, making sure he wasn't too far away from the door opening, that it would result in an uncontrolled flow of ghouls. He unlatched the door, and it immediately flew open under the weight of the creatures outside. The door slammed into his foot and shoulder, creating a 3-foot wide gap. A large zombie in bloody, tattered scrubs shoved its way through, arms flailing and reaching for Kenny, who was a few steps away from it. No Name pushed on the door, slowing the creature down, staying far enough back that he wasn't in arm's reach. Finally, the zombie broke free, taking a couple of steps towards Kenny, who reached out and grabbed its arm. He planted his foot and twisted his body, using the ghoul's momentum to send it staggering across the landing. It slammed into the railing just a couple of yards away, allowing Troy to scoop its leg and fling it over the side. "Fly, bitch, fly!" Troy bellowed, and watched as the creature plummeted to the concrete below, slamming headfirst into the ground. A sickening crack echoed up to them, and the zombie convulsed for a moment before falling lifeless. "One down," he declared. "And a shitload more to go," No Name replied. "Here comes the next one." He released the pressure on the door again, and it opened back up, only this time 2 creatures managed to slither their way through. They were smaller-framed ghouls, both covered in dried blood and bite marks. "Grace, get ready," Kenny cried, and the zombie staggered forward. He reached out and grabbed the lead by the shirt, moving around it as the creature thrashed about. He shoved it into the ghoul right behind it, pinning them to the wall. Grace immediately lunged forward, swinging her knife, and with 2 quick strikes the zombies fell limp. Kenny continued holding them up, reaching around to grab the second one by the shirt to drag them both over to Troy. As the corpses landed with a thud, the football player returned to his post. "All right, give me the next one," he said, rubbing his hands together. No Name nodded, and they continued their assembly line of death. It took a good 15 minutes all told to eliminate the threat on the other side of the door. But finally Troy flipped the last one over the railing. No Name shut the door and walked over to the railing with the others, looking down at the bottom of the stairwell. There were a couple dozen corpses on the ground, only a few managing to barely move, pinned under the weight of others with shattered limbs. "I'll be honest, that went a lot smoother than I thought it would," No Name admitted. Kenny raised an eyebrow. "Good to know you always have faith in your own plans," he drawled. "If I had $1 for every time I've had full faith in my plans during battle," the bold mercenary said, "I might have enough for a soft drink and a bag of chips." Kenny chuckled and shook his head. "Comforting, especially with what we have coming up," he replied. "Come on, let's get those drugs and get out," No Name said, and led the group to the door. He opened it cautiously, just in case of any stragglers, and when there was no noise he carefully moved into the hallway. The group followed, everyone looking around for a threat, but didn't see any movement at all. Grace, you're with me, No Name said quietly. You two head down the other way and see what you can find. Pharmacy is top priority, but if you see big machinery, take note. Kenny cocked his head. How big we talking? He asked. Big, No Name replied. X-ray, MRI, anything like that. They're going to have difficulty to find components that could be useful. Kenny and Troy nodded and headed off to the right, while No Name and Grace moved to the left. They stopped at every door and peered in, looking for trouble and goods. The first room they came to was an office where Grace walked in and grabbed a pen and paper off of the desk. She looked behind it and saw a corpse wearing a bloodied white doctor's jacket with a letter opener sticking out of the side of its head. Nobody here had a good day, she murmured, shaking her head. She rejoined No Name in the hallway, spotting him a few doors up from her. X-ray machine, he called, and she jotted it down on her notepad as they continued up the dimly lit hallway. At every door the bold mercenary paused, making sure it was empty. MRI, he reported, and she noted that as well. As they continued walking, a yell echoed from the other direction. They turned to see it was Troy, and they rushed towards him, drawing their weapons. Whoa, he babbled, raising his hands. We're okay. Sorry, we just found the pharmacy and got excited. No Name and Grace relaxed in relief, but the latter smacked Troy in the back of the head. Think, man, think, she scolded. He nodded apologetically and then waved for them to follow him towards the pharmacy. Kenny stood outside the door looking through a window. There were lots of bloodstains on the inside, many of which looked like handprints. You okay? No Name asked. Kenny nodded. Yeah, I'm good, man, he said slowly. Just something about this sad scene hits me. The group walked up to the bloody window, seeing a lone young woman inside, dead. There wasn't any blood, no bite marks, only a bottle of pills empty beside her. Kenny took a deep breath. I spent weeks isolated and surrounded by those things, he explained softly. I had an escape route, though. I can see myself in her shoes if I didn't know. No Name patted him on the shoulder. Why don't you keep watch? He asked. We'll get this cleared out. Kenny nodded, pressing his lips into a thin line, and then moved back out into the hallway. He kept his head on a swivel, looking back and forth down the hall as the others cleared out the pharmacy. Chapter 9. Kenny stood by a window overlooking the front of the hospital, seeing a few zombies milling about. Now that they had cleared the front of the building, the zombies banging on the front door echoed a little more into the neighborhood, pulling some stragglers. Grace entered and joined him by the window, watching the zombies headed their way. Reminds me of the roaches in my first apartment, she said. No matter how many you kill, there's always more hiding. Kenny chuckled. Yeah, reminds me of my house growing up, he replied. Poor neighborhood in a poor city. On the plus side, having that layer of roaches on the walls provided a little more insulation during the winter. She playfully shuddered at the thought. Well, that just creeped me out, she said dryly. No Name stuck his head in, tossing a large bag to Kenny. We're getting loaded up, he said. Just gotta get an update on the situation from Kemp. He pulled out his walkie-talkie. Kemp, objective secure. What's the situation out there? Starting to get a little dodgy, his friend replied immediately. That dumbass Charlie went on a shooting spree and got these things riled up. They followed us into the neighborhood and are getting scattered all over creation. No Name sighed heavily. Where are you now? He asked. About half a mile from the bridge, Kemp replied. We started to work our way up to you guys and we ran into a wall of them. We've been running some decoys in the neighborhood to keep them out of your way, but we don't know how successful it's going to be. No Name nodded. Understood, he replied. I want you to proceed back to the bridge and get the vehicle. We're going to start moving south on the western road, and we'll be in touch when we run into trouble. I'll be ready for pickup, Kemp replied. Out. No Name put the walkie-talkie away as Troy joined them in the office. Okay, listen up. We have some trouble brewing, so we're going to have to move quickly. No Name explained. We're hauling ass down the western road. If it doesn't need killing, just keep moving. Troy raised a hand. How are we getting out of here? He asked. That first floor has got to be a shit show by now. All three of the others looked at him and then pointed to the window. He took a deep breath and shook his head defeatedly. Hope somebody is planning to catch my fat ass, he muttered. Kenny grinned. "That's what the ground is for," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It'll break your fall pretty good." Troy glared at him, but his grin didn't falter. No Name moved around them and opened the window, which only went halfway. He paused for a moment, grabbing a heavy chair from behind a desk, threw it at the stuck pane, opening it fully. "We gotta move now, let's go," he said, and hopped over the edge of the window, grabbing onto it and lowering himself down. When his arms were outstretched, he let go, dropping several feet onto the grass below. As soon as his boots hit the ground, he drew his knife ready for action. The grassy area was on the side of the building, with about 20 yards of open space before reaching the parking lot near the front. He stared intently for a moment, seeing a few zombies coming out of the neighborhood across the street, but no immediate threat. He turned to wave the others down, and Kenny nodded through the window. The football player hopped over, landing immediately, rebounding to help the others as No Name kept a watch on the area. Grace dropped down next, and Kenny caught her easily. "Trouble coming," No Name murmured. The other two looked over and saw a dozen zombies in the parking lot, several of which had taken notice of them. Grace drew her knife. "Help Troy, I'll keep watch," she said. No Name moved back and helped Kenny grab Troy, who was hanging from the window and struggling with the drop. Finally, after several moments of steadying himself, he let go, the impact knocking the other two down. "Big boy, we're putting you on a diet when we get back," Kenny groaned. No Name helped Troy to his feet. "We gotta get back first," he urged. "Come on." The three men joined Grace as another 10 zombies emerged from the neighborhood behind the initial dozen, making them a formidable force. They were in the parking lot, not more than 30 yards away. "Grace, follow Kenny," No Name instructed. "We're breaking through the line and making a run for the western road. Move!" The group took off running like a shot, spreading out with the 3 men in front, and Grace a couple yards behind the football player. The 3 men each had large canvas bags strapped to their backs, carrying the vital drugs they'd liberated from the pharmacy. They ran hard, picking up a lot of speed. However, Kenny slowed it down a bit so that Grace could keep up. Despite her lithe speed, her legs were a lot shorter than his. No Name was first to the parking lot, picking out a zombie on the far right of the mob. He drove his shoulder into it, picking it up and throwing it to the side in a single motion, while continuing to move forward. Troy opted to just lower his shoulder and plow through the clumsy beasts. Kenny and Grace stayed to the left, not wanting to get caught in the carnage. "Stay on my ass," Kenny bellowed. He knew he had to clear a big hole, so he went out of his way to deliver forceful shoulder hits to the ghouls. There were about 10 directly in front of them, with most of the others in the pack going after No Name and Troy. They were staggered at less than a yard apart, stretching back 10 yards or so. Kenny smacked one on the right, bouncing off of it and immediately shifting his weight to the left, knocking it out of the way and creating a wide gap. He continued to bounce like this, only barely slowing down his momentum. Grace continued to stay close behind. As he reached the last few zombies, he smacked hard into one. However, its foot flipped up, clipping the back of his. Kenny stumbled forward, hitting the ground hard, but he used his pro football reflexes to catch himself with his hands. One nearby ghoul took advantage of the situation, immediately leaning down and reaching out towards the fallen man. The ghoul managed to get its fingertips on Kenny's back before it went flying. Grace lowered her shoulder, ramming it in the ribcage and knocking it away. They didn't speak. Kenny leapt up and they broke through the back of the line. They ran up about 30 yards or so, joining the others before taking a quick breather while walking, to put some distance between them and the zombies. "That was a hell of a hit, girl," Kenny huffed. "Pretty sure I could have gotten you a tryout with my old team." She rubbed her shoulder and winced. "I'll keep my seat in the stands, thank you," she admitted. "Gonna need a lot of ice when we get back." Kenny chuckled as the group picked up the pace, running to the western road and making the turn to the south. The bridge was still 3 miles away. They weren't alone, and they knew this. The group settled into a decent pace, about 10 minutes a mile. The pace was quick for Troy and Grace, who fell back a bit by the time they passed the first mile. Kenny noticed while No Name remained focused on the road ahead. "Hey man, gotta slow it up for a bit," he said. The bold mercenary let out a small huff, knowing he was right, but not happy about it. He immediately slowed down to a fast walk so the others could catch up and recuperate. 2 minutes, he said firmly. "Then we're picking up the pace again." Troy was sucking wind, chest heaving, but Grace was a little better off. They didn't get very far, however, before they had to come to a complete stop. Dozens of zombies emerged from the neighborhood, pouring out onto the western road. They were about 50 yards ahead of the group. No Name ushered the other 3 off of the road, putting a finger to his lips. They took a knee on the side behind a large tree. "We aren't pushing through that," Kenny murmured. The bold mercenary pulled out his walkie-talkie. "Kemp, tell me you're at the vehicle," he said softly, and turned the volume way down. "Just about, Commander," came the immediate reply. "When you get to it, you start coming our way, fast," No Name instructed. "We're on the western road and it's jam-packed with those things." "Damn it," Kemp replied. "We tried to keep them contained, but that group must not have taken the bait." No Name shook his head. "Don't apologize, just get up here," he said. "We're cutting over 2 blocks before continuing south." "I'll be there soon," Kemp promised. "Out." No Name motioned for the group to follow him and took off down a side street to the east. The first block was empty, with only a few corpses scattered about in the road. When they reached the second block, zombies emerged from the side street to the north, attracted to the footsteps. "Forget about them," No Name instructed. "Just pick up the pace and keep going." The group ran hard, needing to hit the next side street before the ghouls. As they reached the intersection, they had to cut through a yard to avoid the mob. When they reached the road, they skidded to a stop at the sight of a couple dozen more ghouls in front of them. There was a brief moment of terror when they realized they were quickly becoming surrounded. No Name looked over, seeing that Troy was completely winded, and Grace, despite her best positive face, looked like she was tiring right out. He knew they'd never make it past the oncoming group. "To the house!" he barked. He led them up to the next house on the corner. There were ghouls within 20 yards of the structure and closing. When he reached the front door, he drew his handgun as he got close. He tried the knob, finding it locked, then immediately started kicking at it. On the third strike, the door broke free from the frame, allowing them inside. He went in first, seeing 2 ghouls coming out of the kitchen. He opened fire, quickly putting the 2 of them down before continuing to sweep the house. The others got inside and pushed the door closed, but it wouldn't latch. "Get the couch!" Kenny barked, and stayed pressed against the door as Troy and Grace raced over to the living room, shoving the couch along the floor. Kenny braced it against the door just as the zombies reached it. He and Troy put their weight against the couch to hold it shut, while a couple more gunshots echoed in the house. No Name reappeared in the living room, seeing the situation and that the door was creaking open despite their best efforts. He rushed over to join them, putting enough weight on the furniture to keep the door shut. As they struggled, he pulled out his walkie-talkie. "Kemp, you got about 5 minutes before we toast," he grunted into the radio. "Hang tight, I'm on the way," his friend replied immediately. "Where are you?" "Just 2 blocks east and head north," No Name replied. "Trust me when I say you'll find us." Grace ran into the kitchen, looking out the back patio door and seeing a fenced-in yard. It was a flimsy chain-link fence, but there were no zombies back there. "Tell him to go to the backyard," she yelled. No Name's brow furrowed. "What?" he called back. "The backyard," she yelled. "It's a cheap fence and there's nothing back there." No Name nodded and turned back to his walkie-talkie as he threw his weight into the couch. "Kemp, when you get here, hit the backyard for pickup," he said. "On it, Commander," came the immediate reply. "Out." The 3 men continued to press themselves against the furniture, holding the ever-growing mob at bay. A moment later, however, the front window glass shattered from the weight of zombies smacking it. The opening was low enough to the ground that the ghouls were able to reach inside pretty far. Grace leapt into action, running to the window with her knife and stabbing skulls. Rotted limbs flailed about, making it difficult to get direct hits, but she managed to kill a few, which gave her more room to operate. She went for another hit, but a zombie grabbed her pants, pulling her in. She quickly adjusted her attack, stabbing furiously at the one who had a hold of her. She overkilled it, her anger causing her to stab it 6 times until it let go. She was just so sick of being in mortal danger. "Don't worry about killing them," No Name said. "Just make sure none of them get in." She took a few steps back, nodding as she breathed heavily. The weight behind the door became too much for them to hold it shut and slowly inched open. No Name planted his feet on the ground, shoving as hard as he could, but it was to no avail. The door just kept opening. "Get to the backyard!" he bellowed. Grace led the way, running out into the yard, staying close to the house for cover. Kenny and Troy were next, leaving No Name alone to hold the door. The entire couch moved, even with him pressing against it. Finally, he broke away as ghouls began to squeeze through the gap. He sprinted through the kitchen, flipping the table over as he went, and slammed into the patio door and joined the others inside against the wall. "They get in?" Kenny asked. No Name nodded. "Yeah, they'll be at the back door soon," he said. "Your boy better hurry up then," Kenny muttered. No Name didn't respond, simply clenching his jaw. He knew that. "Come on, Kemp," he thought, as if his mind could urge his friend to hurry. The group stood in silence, backs pressed up against the wall, listening as the zombies moved through the house and reached the back door. No Name pulled out his handgun, checking the ammo and swapping out mags for a full one instead of the half-empty one he had. As they stood, several zombies began coming up to the chain-link fence, clamoring for them, making all kinds of noise. The quartet watched as most of them stuck on the fence. However, one particularly tall ghoul managed to flip over. As soon as it managed to get to its feet, No Name took aim and fired, dropping it. The gunshot would attract more attention, but it was a necessary evil. The zombies grew even more agitated, and the glass of the patio door creaked. Before it broke, however, they heard the roar of an engine. Second later, an SUV came careening through the fence, sending zombies flying every which way. "Get in!" No Name yelled, and the group didn't have to be told twice. They darted from the wall just as the patio door shattered and dove into the vehicle, slamming the door shut. Kemp punched the gas, tearing through the fence into the neighbor's yard before making a turn for the road. No Name was in the passenger seat, eyes wide as he surveyed the blood and cracks across the windshield. "Rough ride?" he asked. "I've had smoother," Kemp replied dryly. No Name shook his head and let out a deep sigh, glancing back at the 3 civilians in the back seat. They all slumped, exhausted, even Kenny. "Is everybody good?" he asked as he shrugged off his canvas bag and stashed it on the floor. Troy and Kenny nodded, the latter slithering out of his own bag, the former simply using his as a pillow. Grace gave a half-hearted thumbs up. "That's my group," No Name said, taking a deep breath. "Kemp, take us home." His friend didn't need the urging, hitting the gas and speeding through the neighborhood towards the bridge so they could escape back to the island. Chapter 10. The group pulled up to the command center and got out of their vehicles. As they did, Charlie immediately bolted, leaving the team behind. "What's his deal?" Kemp asked dryly. No Name shook his head. "Probably going to snitch on us. I'll make sure everybody gets back safely and the goods get to storage," his friend said. "You should get ahead of this with Theo." No Name nodded. "Yeah, you're probably right," he said, and glanced over at his civilian team. "Good job, everyone," he said with a tired smile. "Get some rest." He inclined his head towards Kenny, "and make sure you talk with Nico." "Heading there now," the football player replied. No Name nodded and walked off towards the command center. As soon as he got inside, someone pointed towards the back room where Theo Atkinson was. The bold mercenary knocked on the glass and was waved in by Theo himself, who stood barking orders into a walkie-talkie. He held up his fingers to No Name. "I don't care what you have to do, just get it hooked up," he continued into the radio. "We need power to that district and need it yesterday." "Yes, sir, I'll keep you posted," the withering voice on the other end replied. Theo tossed the radio down onto the table, looking over to No Name. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked as he appraised the man's appearance of being through hell. "Long day at the office, sir," No Name replied stiffly. "That must have been one hell of a supervising job if it made you look like that," Theo said dryly. Before No Name could continue, yelling erupted in the main area of the command center. They both turned to see Mosley through the window stomping towards them, ranting and raving. He threw open the door so hard it smacked against the doorstop. "There you are, you bold-ass motherfucker," he barked. "How dare you put my man in danger? There's a reason we have these civilian slobs, and it's so we don't have to risk our lives." He stalked up to No Name, who simply stared him down. "You're gonna answer me, goddammit! Why was my man on that island?" "Unless I missed a memo, I don't answer to you," No Name replied calmly. "No, but you do answer to me," Theo spoke up. "And he brings up a good point. Why was Charlie on that island?" "We all were, sir," the bold mercenary replied, turning towards him and ignoring the vibrating Mosley inches away from him, as if he were no more threatening than a gnat. Based on the intelligence reports we had, I felt like the mission wasn't going to get accomplished unless we assisted. I made sure to have a solid plan in place to ensure success with minimal risk. As a result, the only injury is my migraine due to Mosley yelling." The man in question bristled even more, raising his hand, but Theo waved him off. "So, it was a success then?" he asked. No Name nodded. "Yes, sir," he replied. "We have 3 large bags of medical-grade drugs, and located several high-end imaging pieces of equipment should we need the parts later on." "Well, it's hard to argue with success, wouldn't you say, Mosley?" Theo asked, raising an eyebrow. Mosley wrinkled his nose. "Yeah, I guess so," he muttered. "However," he continued with a smirk, "since these guys are so good, I think we should move a couple of them to the arena over the next couple of days. It's not like we have anything else for them to do." "They need time to recuperate," No Name said as smoothly as he could. "You mean you need time to tap that ass?" Mosley drawled. "Don't worry, Baldy. I ain't gonna put your side piece in danger." The bold mercenary fought a rage in his eyes, holding it back as best he could. Mosley sneered at him, catching the vibe. "Let's hold off on taking them to the arena," Theo said. "Still have a couple of things pending." Mosley pursed his lips. "Still on my wish list, though, boss," he said, nearly whining. "Need some better competition in there." "Keep it in your pants," Theo snapped. "Now both of you, out of my office. I got other things to attend to." They exited the office, and Mosley whirled on the bold mercenary. "Don't think I'm not onto you, boy," he said hotly. "I know you're sweet on them, but I wouldn't get too attached if I were you." He smacked him on the arm as if they were best buddies and then sauntered away. No Name stood there swallowing hard. In the back of his head, he knew they'd been onto him. He also knew that the time to get them safely off the island was quickly coming to a close. Chapter 11. Kenny and Captain Nico sat on the back patio, their feet propped up as they sipped drinks, watching the sunset. The conversation had been pretty light-hearted up to that point, but Kenny took a deep breath. "How soon can you get the boat ready?" he asked. Nico's brow furrowed. "Ready for what?" he asked. "For us to get out," Kenny replied quietly. "What about your people?" the captain asked. "They're coming with us," Kenny said. Nico took a long drink and then set down his glass. "The game you are playing is a dangerous one," he said quietly. "I have clout here, but it only goes so far." "Just need enough clout to get across the water to the mainland," Kenny replied, turning to face him. "Across the water?" The captain's confusion furrowed even further. "Why aren't we just sailing away?" Kenny took a deep breath. "Because as soon as they realize something is up, they're coming after us," he explained. Nico nodded thoughtfully. "I have seen the weapons they have on their patrol boats," he said. "I would rather not be on the business end of that if I can help it. But even if we do get across, then what?" "We have friendlies on the other side," Kenny explained. "They'll have shelter and can take us in." The captain shook his head. "It's no good, my friend," he replied sadly. "They will still come and hunt us down. No, we need a better plan, one that involves getting as far away from this place as possible. I know Theo, have known him a very long time. He does not like to be beaten, but above all, he does not like to be insulted. Doing what you want to do is very much an insult." Kenny took a long sip and set down his glass, leaning forward and hanging his head to think. "Okay," he finally said, letting out a deep breath. "I'll have a talk with them. Somebody has got to know some place for us to go." "It's a big country, my friend," Nico said. "Surely not all of it has been destroyed." Kenny sighed. "Are you sure about that?" he asked. "It is what I am choosing to believe," the captain declared, lifting his glass and downing the rest. "And the more of these I have, the more believable it becomes." They shared a laugh, and Kenny shook his head, grabbing his own drink and finishing it off. "Well, let's see if we can make a believer out of me as well," he said. "To the bar!" Nico declared, and both men got up from their chairs, stumbling back towards the house for another refill. It was time to enjoy the downtime as much as possible, because when their plan to rescue the others was put into action, these days would be few and far between. The end. Up next, Knowing that a confrontation with QXR mercenaries is growing more likely by the day, Terrell and Dante lead a team into rural Georgia to find a safe fallback position in Lowcountry Part 15.